Good morning and welcome to another Doomer Optimism Literary Hour. My name is Donald, and it looks like it is another wet day in the Pacific Northwest, which is appropriate for this time of year. And I'm joined by Sally Thomas, who's a poet and a novelist and a short story writer. I think I saw you have a collection of short stories coming out next year. And we're going to talk about her novel Works of Mercy and other writing that she's done. You were an editor for an anthology of Christian poetry with Micah Mattix. Is that right?
That's right.
And so we can talk about that a little bit. And for aficionados of the Doomer Optimism Literary Hour, Tessa Carmen, who was on here the other week, to talk about her translation of The Dream of the Rood, wrote a lovely review of Sally's novel, and that's how I got introduced to it. And so now here she is. So welcome, Humor
Yeah,
Optimism
thank
Literary
you very
Hour.
much,
So
you,
could you
Donald.
introduce your novel uh, to listeners out there who are unfamiliar with it? And on a preface this to say that this is always exciting to me to find um, a contemporary novel that is good, and especially a first novel that is good, because it seems like there's a real lack of such things out there. So, and not even that, a contemporary Christian novel, Catholic novel. Anyway, a rare category of books that's actually worth reading. So, if you could just tease us a listener and introduce your novel a little bit, what it's all about.
Yeah, okay. Works of Mercy is a novel set basically where I live, which is in semi rural North Carolina in the Western Piedmont, kind of between Charlotte and the mountains. Which I mentioned just because the landscape is beautiful and it plays a role in the setting of the novel. The protagonist is a woman named Kirsty, who is somewhere in her 60s. She is a transplant to this part of North Carolina from a remote from the Shetland Islands, which are you probably know. People have probably maybe seen the detective series, which I had not seen before I wrote the novel. I actually watched it to like check my research, and that's how I got hooked on it. But from this remote, very windswept place in the north of Scotland, where she has almost, you might say, accidentally, been transposed from there to this North Carolina rural setting by a marriage which happens very much almost as an accident, kind of a rebound. So a lot of the novel deals with her history and how she's gotten to be where she is, but in the present, she is widowed. She is very solitary. At one point, she says that if she'd been born in a different century, she might have made an adequate anchoress. And so she's this very inward person who goes to church but is not interested in engaging with people. And she gets called kind of out of the blue to be the housekeeper for her parish priest, which she's done for some years when the novel opens. And as the novel opens, a new young priest has just been sent to replace the kind of old jaded priest who's been there. And he comes with his own set of problems and anxieties and things that he has to work out about
He's a
his
real piece
vocation.
of work.
Well, he's not modeled on any particular person I know, I have to say. I actually There's kind of a joke at the beginning of the novel that I did lift wholesale from a Catholic priest I know who used to be our pastor. Um, I actually credited him at the end of the novel, and I saw him a long time afterward, and I said, "Oh, by the way, I stole your joke. It's in my novel." And I said, but don't worry, the priest isn't you. I said something like this. It's this young priest tells this story, but he's not you. And he laughed and said, oh, ha, 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 he's young. Of course, he's not me. So yeah, Father Schuyler is kind of a piece of work. And in a way, he and Kirsty have this kind of parallel story where they're both finding their way to something fuller and better and more healed. Kirsty gets sort of sucked against her will into the life of this big chaotic family who experience a tragedy, which in a lot of ways breaks open her old wounds. She also acquires, as if by accident, a really weird cat. And so this cat also features in this novel. And so everybody in this novel is sort of moving toward some kind of redemption that isn't necessarily complete at the end of the novel, but they're all on their way there at the very least.
And it's hard. It's going to be a little bit hard to talk about because it's the sort of book that you don't want to give away.
Right.
There are that. So we'll have to tread
Yeah, so we'll
lightly.
try to skirt around the spoilers, right?
Yeah, because it is. I mean, it's really, it's not that. It's a story that it's not one of these novels that's kind of just setting a mood and nothing really happens. No, there's real characters who are. It's a real story, and so yes, you had to go and buy the book and read it to find out the nature of the tragedy. I mean, there's also a lot of interesting, like Jewish Catholic stuff that comes out in the novel and in relation to that tragedy. And it's not. I mean, it's yeah. There's real tragedy and problems, but the novel's not cloying, nor obviously didactic. I mean, it's beyond. Anyway, I'm just gonna. I can just keep doing praising it with more and more adjectives. But have you been to the Shetland Islands?
I have not actually. And how I arrived at that, people always ask this, and this is on like my bucket list of things to do. My husband and I went to Norway last spring, which is the first place we've been in like 20 years. So it was very exciting. And we really tried to like work a trip to Shetland in there, and it just didn't work. It was too far. But the novel, I mean, the process of writing the novel, the first sentence of the novel is the first sentence that I wrote, which is kind of unusual. Often, you write a beginning and then you like cut off the beginning and you begin where the story really gets going. But in this case, I wrote this sentence. On Mondays, I cleaned the rectory for the good of my soul, which I do not have the book memorized, but I'm very familiar with that sentence by now. And from the moment I wrote that sentence, I didn't know who was saying it. But I kept writing more sentences to try to find out. And it became apparent to me pretty quickly that the person who was saying this, like I didn't know, I knew it was a woman. And I kind of felt like she was older, not a young woman. It became clear to me that she was an Anglophone, but that she was an American. And so the big question became, well, where in the British Isles is she actually from? And we actually, we lived in Cambridge from 1999 to 2003 while my husband was doing his PhD in theology. And that's probably why, I don't know, like they're just, like I didn't acquire an accent. My children did. My children became very thoroughly English.
Oh,
But
fascinating.
yeah, no, that's a whole story.
Has that stuck?
What?
Did that stick coming back?
No, no. Although my oldest daughter went back to Cambridge when she was in college. She spent a semester in Rome and went to Cambridge during that semester. And she found we had left when she was 9,
Mm-hmm.
and she found that like she couldn't speak American English when she was there. It was very weird. She went to see an old friend of ours who said, "Your accent," and she said, "I know, I can't help it. This is how I talk when I'm here." But I guess I have an ear for voices and
Hmm.
accents, and it's very easy for me in writing to kind of channel this particular kind of voice. But I sort of I didn't want to get sucked into writing a novel about Cambridge because it would end up being just gossipy or something. And the people, I was too close to real people there. And in one sense, I needed the distance of a place that I didn't know anybody and could sort of just make things up a little bit as long as it was grounded in the real place. I also developed the sense very quickly, well, of her as sort of this misanthropic person, and of her having come from a fairly isolated place where anywhere else she went, she would kind of be an oddity, even, in the British Isles, where she goes to an English university and she's kind of out of, a fish out of water there. Even going to Aberdeen to convent school, she's kind of a fish out of water because she comes from this tiny remote place, even though actually there's, a lot of back and forth between the Shetland Islands and Aberdeen. But yeah, so I sort of lighted on this and I experimented with like, well, okay, are you Welsh? Are you where, around the edges of
Yeah, sure.
main island. I was sort of casting around and somehow I did stumble on some stuff about Shetland and I got fascinated with that culture and its crossover with Norse culture. And, and the way that even in Scotland, I mean, they're Scottish, they're Scots, but they're not like other Scots. They have this whole other overlay and long tradition with its whole character. And once I sort of went in that direction, I did a lot of research and I listened to a lot of like people telling stories and songs and things like that. That became a decision that gave me a lot. So it was like a lot of things, it was kind of accidental. But once I committed to that direction, it became this really fruitful kind of line in the narrative. But I do feel like kind of a fraud because I've never been to Shetland and I had to just like make it up. And I live in fear of someone from Shetland going, you know what? You have appropriated our culture. Um,
That's fiction. You have, it's all right. Is
yeah, I kind of told myself that.
is Edwin Muir from that, or he's from the
Ooh,
Orkney? Is Orkney
something like
different?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess Orkney is kind of south of Shetland. It's a little
Okay.
bit closer in.
But anyway,
Um,
The Scottish Islands have it. Yeah, it's like their own dialect. They have their own dialects and their um. Yeah,
yeah, and
the
distinct
name.
culture from one set of islands to another. I mean, I think the Orkney Islands are culturally really different from the Shetland Islands, for
Hmm.
example.
So this didn't occur to me until just now, but you have two interesting mixed marriages in the novel. So the protagonist growing up with a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, and her grandmother, I guess, is some sort of like really low church.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they're like a sect of a sect of a sect of the
yeah,
sect,
some
in
really.
its front room.
Hmm. And then you have this family, this large family at her parish who's also a mixed marriage, the Catholic mother and a Jewish father, and just thinking of that those two, that all of the characters pretty much are sort of all fishes out of water. That none of them
Yeah.
really fit in. Um, like the priest also doesn't really fit in. I mean, the priest is sort of terrified of speaking to like anyone. He finishes mass and then locks himself away as quickly as he can. Um,
Right.
so you live in North Carolina. Are you from North Carolina?
I'm actually from Tennessee, so,
Okay.
which used to be part of North Carolina
Yeah, so
back in the
close enough.
era, but yeah, right, right. But we've lived in North Carolina for 15 years.
And uh, so, I mean, I'm curious, thinking of this novel as a Southern novel. Um, I mean, does that make sense to say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think inescapably, just because
Hmm,
I'm a Southerner and I have mostly lived. I mean, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I went to college in Nashville. I lived in North Carolina for 3 years before I met my husband, who is also from Memphis, Tennessee. And then, we've had these odd like forays into different. We lived in Utah for 8 years, and now for something completely different. And then we lived in. I love Utah. I mean, I just loved it. But it was, like I hadn't really made a list of places that I expected never to live in my life. But if I had, Utah would have been right up there. And other than here, that's the longest I've lived anywhere. And then we did the 4 years in Cambridge. So, before coming back to Tennessee and then eventually North Carolina. So we both spent most of our life in the South. Our whole families are Southern. And in a lot of ways, I guess, inescapably, no matter where I set a story, in a sense, it's going to be a Southern story because I just, like I'm interested in telling stories about people in the way that Southern people traditionally have. But I also, I mean, it's interesting actually being a Catholic in a small Southern town because
hmm.
that's not, we're hardly a majority religion. And, for the longest time,
Outside of
everybody,
Louisiana, I guess, or parts of
yeah,
Louisiana.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I mean, Memphis is actually fairly Catholic because there was a lot of Italian and Irish and German immigration in the 19th century, but North Carolina is very not, thinly Catholic. So for a long time, all the people we knew in this small southern town were like from New Jersey or Costa Rica. I
Hmm.
mean, it's like your Catholic parish is this weird island of people who are from somewhere else, and that's interesting too. I mean, I think that was at the back of my mind in writing the novel, just that even in this, that you would be moving back and forth between these two worlds. And of course, Kirsty's husband is a hometown boy, and
Hmm.
her, again, out of syncness with him and her mother-in-law with whom they live. And
Who's sort of in parallel with her grandmother, parallel
yeah,
figure to her grandmother. Uh,
right, right. But
yeah, she's
yeah,
sort
I
of a
guess,
stranger in her own house, right? Her mother, because she's
right,
living in her mother-in-law, moves into her mother-in-law's house, who really rules the house.
right. And even
Is
after
very
her mother-in-law
particular.
dies, her husband is saying things like, "Well, Mama bought that mattress. Mama bought this carpet."
Yeah, he's the mama's boy for sure.
Yeah, right, right.
And her husband, and yeah, it's a lot of interesting parallels between the characters. So before you wrote this novel, you were a poet.
Mhm.
And did you expect to write a novel eventually, or was it a surprise to you?
It really surprised me that I finished one. Like, I'm still in shock. I can't believe I have not been a finisher typically, and my Google Docs is just, like, full of beginnings of
Oh, you
novels.
and me both. Yeah, it's
I mean, just kind and then it just kinda, like, breaks down where I don't know where to go next or what it's about, and, I mean, especially when I had kids at home, poetry was good because you can finish a poem pretty fast. Or you can, take a word out and put another word in, or change the semicolon to a comma or a dash or whatever, and feel like, okay, that's it. I've done my work for the day. I've done that. So I was really surprised, and I can't actually remember when I started writing this novel, probably about maybe 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And I wrote that first sentence, and I kept writing another sentence and another sentence and another sentence. And I kept thinking, this is going to go nowhere. This will be fun. Um, and I'd written some short and published some short stories by that point. So I knew like I could write some fiction. I knew I could write prose, but, yeah, I forget at what I think I just find, and I'd go and I'd do something else, and I'd come back to this story and I'd write a few more scenes, or I'd say, oh no, wait, this isn't quite right. And I'd go back to the beginning again and I finally pushed it to a point, and I don't really remember how, but I thought I could actually get to the end of this. Like if I just kept going and didn't let myself go back and be perfectionist about it, I could actually keep adding scenes until I get to something like an end. And and that really was kind of like the tipping point where I actually could see that even though I didn't know what was going to happen, I could just keep writing scenes and they'd go somewhere because I'd already kind of gotten somewhere. I mean, it's funny that you say, things happen and it's not just characters doing something. I mean, I'm great at like writing dialogue. I'm great at just like atmosphere. I'm great at like this person having this thought and this moment, but actually having something happen is a real challenge. And I kind of forget at what point I thought maybe I'd written up to the point where she gets sick. And I thought, okay, well, some stuff has happened here. And maybe some stuff could happen after that. And maybe I should just keep going. But I mean, it was astonishing to me that I actually did that and didn't just think about it.
Were you still writing poems while you were writing the novel?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, my first book, Motherland, which is a collection of poems, came out in 2020, and so I was still writing and revising and working on poems, and definitely I was working on works of mercy at that point, although I can't remember like what the balance
Mm.
was. And then I finished works of mercy really at a residency in the summer of 2021. And at that point, I was pretty solidly. Well, I was working on the novel, and I was working on essays for Christian Poetry in America, which is the anthology, at the same time. So that was like a big prose year. 21 and 22 were big prose years. But I'll go through phases where prose is really satisfying to me. Like I really like being able to stretch out in sentences and paragraphs and make a world that I can move around in a little bit in the guise of some character. I mean, that's really fun. But then I'll just suddenly write a run of poems. So I kind of go back and forth. I'm always working on things in rotation because I just, like I can't just be like, here is my project. I will do my project until I'm finished with my project. I'm very distractible. So, having something, like going in the rock tumbler all the time, whatever it is just how I work.
Were you reading anything in particular when you were writing this?
Uh, the novel that I think was like really important for works of mercy, and I don't know that I was reading it, but I've read and reread it a bunch of times. But Edwin O'Connor's The Edge of Sadness is, I think it was published in 1959, and it's this wonderful novel whose narrator is a priest, kind of late in his career after some crises, and he is this wonderful first person narrator because first of all he's very funny, and his problem, kind of like Kirsty's, is detachment, that he has this ironic detachment where he's noting things and making these ironic asides about them, and describing things that his young curate is doing. And the curate is like, at least at the beginning, he's this complete figure of comedy. Although I mean, he emerges as this really heroic. I mean, the narrator begins to realize how heroic he really is. So you, the reader, do too. But I just loved that voice. And when I thought about, like, there's no way I could write a Dostoevsky novel. But I thought, I could maybe write a novel like this with this kind of voice that where you could move around from being funny and ironic to being, as a part of the character's own growth and development and self-realization, that the voice could move beyond that funny, ironic level to say things that are, intensely um, personal and painful and true. So that's probably the main thing. I mean, I did during this residency, I did read things like James Wood's How Fiction Works. I read Caroline Gordon's How to Read a Novel. I mean, there were a lot of these sort of books on
Were those
craft that
helpful?
yeah, they were actually, because they helped me see, like I had a bunch of writing done at that point, but they really helped me see how I could revise it and make it better and, and see the fault lines and see like, oh yeah, characters are supposed to do that. Like I really hadn't had any, I mean, I did MFA work in poetry, all like my graduate work had been in poetry. With very little, but I've been a reader of fiction all my life. Um, I just have always devoured novels and, but I hadn't really thought a lot about fiction craft until suddenly I had like 250 pages of something that I had to figure out what to do with,
The Gerald, I don't know why this just comes to me, but Gerald Murnane, the Australian novelist,
Mhm.
taught for a long time in a community college in his little town in Australia, fiction writing, which is amazing for those students. But he always insisted that in order to teach something, you have to actually show someone how to do it. And so he would write
Mhm.
in front,
Huh.
he would work
Wow.
on stories in front of his students so they could
Yeah,
see what it looked like,
that's brilliant.
which is awesome, but also would just be really bizarre to watch. But the book that he always recommends, which I've never read, but I guess is Booth's The Rhetoric of Fiction.
Yeah, I haven't read that
Which is
either.
one of these like books, sort of like the ones you mentioned. That's kind of a famous one. But I always, when I think of like teaching writing, I always think of Gerald Murnane in a
Mm,
community college classroom, like at the blackboard writing a
yeah.
story,
Writing. Oh,
like
that's amazing.
in front of his students, and just the guts that takes,
Yeah, yeah, no
to do that
kidding.
in front of the class. But it also just how straightforward his thinking is. Like, well, if I'm teaching them I'm supposedly teaching them how to do this, I better, you know,
Yeah, yeah, you gotta be the object lesson.
yeah, I better
Yeah.
show them. So, okay, so you have new books coming out next
Mhm.
year.
That's
Both,
right.
am I right to say you have a short story collection and a book of poems?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, my short story collection, The Blackbird and Other Stories, we're shooting for August as a publication date from Wiseblood Books. And then my book of poems, Among the Living, will be out sometime late in the fall or early winter of next year.
And Wiseblood Books is part of this sort of mini renaissance of print on demand publishers who there's
Yeah,
a ton of them now, and it's interesting because in some ways print on demand has been a blessing, in some ways it's been terrible. So when
right.
done well, it's been very good. Now Oxford University Press, on the other hand, has taken their back catalog and they sell it as these very expensive, poorly made print on demand books. I've had correspondence with editors there complaining about it, which is I'm such a busybody. It's not. I'm not going to change their mind. But,
Yeah,
Dear Oxford
yeah,
University Press, how can you let Jeffrey Hill's work sit in these terrible, these
yeah,
terrible
yeah,
print-on-demand books with
yeah,
bad
you can't
binding?
shoot for it. Oh,
If you're
yeah,
gonna do
yeah,
it, sell them cheap at least. But okay, so my griping aside, the
right.
cool thing about print on demand is that it's allowed all these little publishers with very little overhead
Mhm.
publish new writing and get fairly wide distribution. I mean, sort of
Right,
instantly, like, your book, it's not anyone can order it. It's not, you don't have to like write to an obscure PO box or go through any arcane thing. So
right,
um,
right.
there's been a sort of flowering of lots of little publishers, which
Mhm,
Wiseblood is a good example, who are publishing not just novels, but essay collections and poetry collections,
mhm,
which
mhm.
don't tend to sell very well. I mean, it's hard, and so it's
Right,
if you got to put a pack of warehouse of physical books, it's a really hard proposition to publish new sort of lesser known poets or poetry anthologies. My goodness, I mean,
right, yeah, yeah, right, right.
uh, so it's a really interesting time, and there are so many of these that I think, like, there's an idea tossed around sometimes that, oh, mainstream publishers so horrible, that there's all of these amazing writers out there writing amazing
Mm,
books that never get seen. But I think it simply cannot be true anymore. If you've
right.
written an amazing book, there is someone out there for you.
There's someone
Or my
out there.
God, just publish it yourself. So um, there's no excuse anymore. Everyone has to go out there and you know, write your book. There's a way to get it out. Uh,
Right, right.
so I'm curious. I don't know. It turns into a question. So you've worked with Wiseblood.
Mhm.
Like, how do you see the state of American literature now? It's a broad question, but I mean, like, where do you're sort of in the thick of it, like writing poetry, writing short fiction, writing a novel, editing, this interesting historical anthology of Christian poetry. I mean, you're in the thick of it. So where, like, what do you, how's it going? How are things going? I feel like I'm simultaneously optimistic and just in the depths of despair when I think about it. So I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
I guess that's the Doomer optimism way that we feel
Yeah,
this.
right, exactly.
Platform.
Happy despair,
Yeah.
despairing joy. I don't know. I mean, it's changed a lot in the years that I have even been paying attention. I mean, I was in graduate school from 1989 to about 1995. And that was sort of the era still, I mean, for better or worse, when there were, I think of it as like there were giants in the earth. I mean, I studied with Mark Strand, for example, who
Mhm.
was like one of those giants in the earth. I mean, those were the years when, any creative writing program with a visiting writers program would get Seamus Heaney or W.S. Merwin. I'm trying to think of all the people I had dinner with in my 20s, in groups of people. Um, Richard Wilbur.
There were still
Um,
major poets.
there were still major poets. I mean, they
I
were
don't think the
mostly men.
term even major or minor poet means anything anymore,
Yeah, yeah, it kind of doesn't. I mean, and that's kind of where I'm going. And like, and
especially with
this
Louis
is,
Gluck. Maybe was sort of the last
yeah,
one,
yeah.
and
Or
now
I
we've
mean,
lost her.
Lori Graham is still here. Who
I
was
won't
another
say
one.
anything.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I know. I mean, I'm dropping names without any like,
yeah, I
name
understand.
dropping, not imply endorsement. Um,
Her career is one of the great mysteries of she must be a great dinner guest or something. I don't know. But anyway, carry on.
Yeah, she's a pretty interesting dinner guest, I'll say that. We also had dinner with her.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Can't
a
make heads or
pretty
tails of her work. But anyway,
yeah. Um, yeah, where there were sort of the acknowledged, and most of it was coming out of the University of Iowa. I mean, the
mhm.
writers workshop there, of course, is old and famous and was, I mean, I think it's probably still kind of an epicenter, but I think it's there's not just one epicenter anymore. And there's not just one sort of pantheon of great. I mean, like, I don't know that there's anybody right now that you would necessarily point at and go, whether, however, I personally feel about this person's work, this is a major poet. Um, Mostly because everybody seems still too young. I mean, like, it's too early to tell. That generation, has all largely died. Um,
It was interesting. I mean, if you
and
think
I
of
think,
Merwin or Donald
mhm.
Hall,
Yeah,
another
yeah,
tip,
yeah,
they knew
Donald
they
Justice.
knew they knew Ezra Pound and Robert
Yeah,
Frost. They had that direct connection to the
yes,
first generation of modernism. They were friends or
yeah,
students or correspondents with them, and
yeah,
and
absolutely.
uh,
And then
and they
I
were all
think that,
translators too, which is an interesting thing that I feel like has maybe been not entirely lost, but lost a little bit. Like
yeah,
when
I don't
Merwin
miss.
went to Pound and to ask for advice as a young poet, Pound said, "Well,
Yeah,
your poems are all going to be bad because you haven't done anything with your life, and that's okay. Keep writing them, but you need to
right.
go learn Provençal or and
Yeah, and
translate for a
translate.
while because that's how you're going to learn." And
Yeah.
Merwin had a lovely book about moving to southern France and learning
Mhm.
the language and doing, and it's a great, yeah, it's a great story of sort of coming of age and learning to be a poet. But I wonder if,
Yeah,
I don't know, I'm totally out of touch. You're more in it, I think, of if that's
yeah.
something that poets still do.
Oh yeah, it absolutely, like, I'm kind of unusual in not really being a translator, and it's probably a real deficit for me. Most of the, especially formalist poets I know, are also serious translators.
There's still time for you.
There's still time.
You can
Well,
learn
yeah,
Old
yeah.
Irish or something.
I could. You're right. That's it. Well, I keep thinking I need to learn Welsh. That's because I've written some poems in English and Welsh forms, and I think these probably aren't that good because I don't actually know how Welsh works
Oh,
beyond
that
a
would be
few,
fantastic. Yeah.
you know. Um, but yeah, no, there are a lot of poets who are still translators. I think there's been, with the rise of the internet and the possibility of online communities. I mean, in one ways, of course, this atomizes everything, as we know. But on the other hand, it means that you don't have to live in New York to know people, which is sort of nice if you can't afford to live in New York. Um, and and I mean, I think as opposed to there being one scene where there are the acknowledged famous people who run everything and judge all the contests and whatever. I mean, what we have is, just a bunch of overlapping scenes. And to one extent, you can find, like, I am not in the mainstream of American poetry. It's people are doing things that are just not what I do. Um,
I guess A. Stallings is the
communities,
Oxford
sorry.
A. Stallings is the Oxford professor of poetry, which is neat. That
Yeah,
like it has to be the first time a Southern
a
American
Southern,
has been
yeah.
to Oxford, and her poems are very interesting.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um, and
mhm,
she's
there are
like
a lot.
from Georgia but lives in Greece. Anyway, a fascinating. I don't know if
Yeah,
she's the closest thing we have to like a major poet now. Maybe.
yeah, I think you're probably right about that, and there are plenty of people who would say who, again, have a lot of influence in certain circles, who would just, I mean, dismiss her formalism, for example, as retrograde, or uninventive, or, not subversive enough, or whatever, and I just, yeah, I mean, that's what I say,
The
you
poems
know,
are the poems good or are the poems not good? Like that's
Yeah, well, right. Yeah, to me, that's the question, right? I think there are circles where there are lots of where you have to qualify, where people feel like they have to qualify good in ways that I wouldn't. So yeah, but no, I think definitely she is a major figure, and certainly being recognized overseas in ways that maybe, I mean, not that she's not pretty famous over here, but
Mm.
she has made that sort of international leap. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's been really a great experience for me to, well, to be with the publishers that, Wiseblood is my fiction publisher. Able Muse Press is a small press, which is my poetry publisher.
Mhm.
And, having like gone to graduate school and felt kind of out of sync with a lot of people I was in school with, and out of sync with, like I went to the Breadloaf Writers Conference in 1993, and, which was the era of, Mark Strand was there, Donald Justice was there, these big, big guys. But just feeling like, well, maybe fish out of water, or just,
That's in
my natural,
Middlebury.
those are my people because that's me. For a long time, I just kind of felt like I probably didn't like other writers that much. And I didn't really cultivate friendships with other writers because I just felt out of sync with people. But, it's been marvelous in the last few years to have writer friendships and people I genuinely like as people and admire as artists, and, and to be able to have those conversations. And they really are, I mean, kind of the people in the formalist orbit around Able Muse Press, and then people in the kind of Catholic orbit around Wiseblood Books, and then there's a lot of overlap between those two orbits. So it's nice. And it's a real gift, because it was the kind of thing I couldn't, I used to just think, oh yeah, I mean, so the Inklings went to the pub in Oxford and seemed to have liked each other. Is that even possible anymore? Or where are all these people? I would read like Flannery O'Connor's letters and just be like, where are these, publishers that you actually want to have lunch with? Or where are these other writers that you really want to have these conversations with? Because, I haven't met anybody I get along with that well. And it's just been marvelous actually to meet those people and to think, oh,
Mm.
you can kind of have that world. You can kind of have that experience. And again, as much as internet life has had negative ramifications for us culturally, nothing is ever without its unexpected graces. I
Yeah,
forget what.
Red Loaf is in Vermont.
Sorry, say that again.
Red Loaf is in Vermont, right at Middlebury.
Yeah, yeah.
Vermont, at least Vermont in the summer is just wonderful.
Oh, it's
If you didn't,
great.
even if you didn't like anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really true that I didn't like anybody. I just felt, I don't know, like I was in a room full of people who maybe weren't that friendly. But
Sure. There's
no,
probably
but it's beautiful. And what I really would love is for some. I mean, it was great because it was like being at summer camp for 2 weeks with other writers, and if I could pick which writers I went to summer camp with, I would totally do that. Like we need another something like that.
Mhm. It's interesting that a lot of the poets who, I mean, okay, this might just be speaking to the sort of what I read or the bubble I'm in, but it seems like a lot of the energy in poetry now is Christian, or at least Christian adjacent, which I'm not sure how that happened, like when that turned. I mean, I'm thinking of like I don't know, Dana Goya, and even Stallings, who's, I mean, her children are baptized into the Orthodox Church. I don't know her, but
Yeah,
she's at least, I don't know, open to it, or Juicer. I don't know. It's interesting that there's James Matthew Wilson.
mhm.
Um it's interesting that um there is the sort of formalist, or at least sort of formalist poetry, Christian poetry, has kind of persisted, and I don't know, seems to have at least a little bit of wind in its sails now. And I think partially because of the possibility of these small publishers able to put out work, because I think it's,
Right.
in terms of like, I'm sure who's getting grants and university appointments, it's not really that that's a whole different thing. But
Yeah.
it seems to
Right.
me
Right.
that the
Right.
stuff getting grants and university appointments, the poetry just isn't very good and no one reads it. So it doesn't really matter. But that people are finding a small readership anyway, and I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to see how it turns out. But I was just thinking this, so Louise Gluck died recently.
Right.
Saskia Hamilton died earlier this year. And I was thinking
Right.
about about what a great loss for both of them, for American literature. Um, and I think sometimes, like, in my when I'm feeling a little down, the lights are going out in the house and there's no new lights coming on. But and just thinking out loud, talking to you, was like, actually,
Yeah.
there are new
Yeah.
lights. There are things happening.
Yeah.
It's not just
Yeah.
it's we're not just putting the culture is not just being put to bed forever or something, even though it feels like that sometimes. Uh,
Yeah, 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 I know. No, I think, and it's interesting because nobody knows where things are going. And so many of the people who are um, part of this energy are relatively young, and where their careers are going to go, where their work is going to go. I mean, the main thing is just, I think, you know, getting people to read poetry is the other part of the equation. I mean, because you can have a culture of poets talking to each other and reading each other, which is largely what the state of affairs has been for the last 50 or 60 years at least. And yeah, I mean, like my other job, I write for the New York Sun newspaper, where we run a poem of the day column every weekday. And a friend and I share the writing of this, and our aim in doing it is, and every day it's usually a public domain poem, although we do solicit poems from living poets as often as we can, given that we have no budget. But so these public domain poems that we introduce with maybe like a 3-paragraph little essay to set up the reading of the poem. But what feels important about that enterprise is that, newspapers used to run poems regularly. Like, if you read the newspaper, whatever your local newspaper was, you could potentially read a poem in every issue of that newspaper. It might not be a good poem. People like Edgar Guest, rose to fame as newspaper poetry writers. But that this would be something that wasn't often some academic hinterland talked about by experts, that it was something that you actually, the ordinary reader of the newspaper, could at least read and go, oh, huh, okay, and maybe recite to somebody if you really liked it, or write it in somebody's yearbook, or whatever. And I mean, kind of as part of that, one of the things that my friend and I have been knocking back and forth as a question is, when did people stop acquiring at least the basic competency of writing verse? I mean, we ran a poem a few weeks ago that was like Jane Austen juvenilia. It was either maybe it was in a letter that she wrote. I can't remember. Anyway, it's like this poem about some man not giving her friend a ride in the carriage to wherever she wanted to go. It's this funny little poem. And like, it's not a great poem, but she knew how to write in rhyme and meter. And an observation that we've made is that once upon a time, this was something that people could just do, just as they knew how to write a letter. You would know how to write a little poem, and somehow that poetry has become this sort of rarefied province, where it's its own culture that operates maybe separately from everyday culture. Is Well, Dana Gioia would say that was part of the problem. I mean, he had that essay in 1991, Can Poetry Matter, which was basically about that. And it
There's a
seems like that's
similar there's
part
something
of the.
with architecture. So I
Mm-hmm.
saw a great lecture uh, in Seattle from the local chapter of the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture, and the guy was walking us through a building. It was this beautiful building in New York, and at the end of it, he goes, and the architect who designed this is so and so. None of you have ever heard of him. He became an architect going to night school
Hmm.
and was a no-name guy, but he had there was a pattern to building that he learned that meant that anyone who was just competent, who was trained in that pattern of building, could produce a beautiful
Mhm.
building.
Right.
To be a
Yeah.
genius, you didn't have to be a big name. You learned a pattern of building, and okay, these are the proportions you need. This is how you use an arch. This is how you use such and such. And
Right.
you can produce a fine building. Now, are you gonna produce, Chart or whatever? No. Okay, you're not gonna produce something like World Historic that's gonna make people weep, but you're gonna
Right.
produce a fine looking building that will last and that will, be beautiful. And I think it's something like that those patterns of writing, you
Yeah.
do something like sort of competent light verse
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
pleasant to read and nice to hear and is fun to share, uh,
Right.
and read aloud. And you don't have to be a genius to do it if you learn
Right.
those patterns. And then there are geniuses who can
Yeah.
do the thing beyond,
Right.
thing beyond that. So I think and the same for music too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and just you could go across all of human culture.
Right. Right. Yeah. There's certainly, analogs all across, all the art forms, and cultural whatever.
And
But
things have become
certainly.
more and more dominated as things become more and more dominated by people with college degrees and graduate degrees. They tend
Mm-hmm.
to become more rarefied and worse. If you think of like really the great products of American culture that we've, so much of it is the energy and the force behind it is people who never went to college.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
mean, that's often
or
the
even high
case.
school in a lot of cases. I mean, who was really, like developed like America's great music forms and stuff. Anyway,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah, certainly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But I think that that's definitely, it can only help an art form to have as broad and informed audience as possible. And in the case of poetry, I mean, by informed, I just mean people who assume that they can read poetry because they have read poetry. And admittedly, it's always interesting to me that people say, "Oh no, I mean, like I started out my adult life as a high school English teacher, and I was astonished when I started this job at the age of 21 as this wide-eyed, idealistic person who looked 15. So it was all just great. Got eaten for breakfast every day, but I was astonished that virtually all of my colleagues would go to unbelievable lengths to avoid having to teach poetry.
Mm.
These were English teachers who just thought, I don't like poetry, I don't understand poetry, and I can't talk about it. And I thought, well, there's not going to be any knock-on effect there, is there? Like there was this one film strip of, this is how long ago it was. There was this one film strip of the poetry and rock and roll that made the rounds at the English department, and that was like poetry for a lot of classes. And but it's always been remarkable to me that people will go, oh, I don't like poetry, I don't read poetry, it's too hard. But they don't say that about novels, even though some novels are really hard. I mean, and I point this out to people when I'm talking about poetry, like, every novel is not Ulysses, and we mostly know this. um, every poem is not, the Orchards of Sion or something. Like there might be poems that are hard for you to read, but that it doesn't follow that every poem is hard for you to read, or that, every good poem is hard for you to read. So there's that. So this is kind of like my little crusade all the time. Put poetry in front of people.
There was a movie which I have never seen, Four Weddings and a Funeral, and
Oh
in one
yeah.
of the scenes, a character reads a poem by Auden.
Yeah,
Wasn't
yeah,
one of
yeah.
Auden's famous poems, but in the aftermath of that movie, the collection in which that poem appears sold
Oh, it
hundreds.
became one of Auden's famous
Yeah, it
poems.
became a famous poem by Auden just because of its recitation in that movie. And I don't know that there's a when it used to the people used to buy records of Dylan Thomas reading poems,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
and then he would go, he would tour and read not only his own but read other people's poems, and there's still something of that. Like you can listen to, you know, such and such actor reading from the four quartets or whatever, which seems
Right.
really good, salutary to have, great actors reading
Mhm.
poetry. So you do the New York Sun poems with Jody Bottom, is
Yeah,
that
that's
right?
right.
Have you two? What response have you received? What do the readers of the New York Sun think of it? Have you gotten any feedback?
I really don't know, and I keep meaning to ask him, because he talks to the editorial hierarchy, and I really don't. So I have no idea what our readership is. In fact, this is a plug for the New York Sun Poem of the Day, because maybe one more reader would make a difference. Yeah, no, I have no idea. I mean, I do know some people, like friends of ours, who subscribe and read, but then these are mostly people who are reading stuff anyway.
Hmm.
But I hope it's there. It's in the culture section. I mean, it's online, so you have to go to the culture section and click on it. It's not the same thing as like you're leafing through the newspaper and there it is on the page with something else that you wanted to read. And there's a certain amount of intentionality involved, and I have to find this thing to read it online. But yeah, I have no idea. I mean, apparently the senior editors are happy with what we do, so I presume that means we have at least 5 readers. I don't I don't know.
Right. It used to be that poetry collections would be reviewed in local newspapers too. It's always
Right.
funny picking up an old book of poems and you see blurbs on the back from a review from, a newspaper in Detroit and a newspaper in
Right.
Sacramento, and be like, oh, they had sort of book review sections that were
Mhm.
wide ranging enough that they were reviewing,
Yeah. Oh,
book.
the Memphis Commercial Appeal had a great book reviews. I still know at least tangentially know the guy who was the book reviewer. That I mean, they don't anymore, but as newspapers have gotten bought out by conglomerates, that's been the thing that's gone. But yes, local papers absolutely ran really good book reviews often. And that's how you'd find out
Hmm.
what you read.
Well, that world has come and gone. We'll see what comes in its place. So, a question that I always forget to ask, but is a customary Doomer optimism question, is to answer the combo question, like, in what way are we doomed, and then what are you optimistic about?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I mean, I guess, and I don't think of myself as an optimist, really. Like, I'm not
Yeah,
that cheerful person.
I
But,
understand.
I mean, the Roman Empire fell and an entire civilizations rose in its place, which managed to hang on to at least some things that were valuable and take them forward. And I do think, I mean, cultures are always renewing themselves, which, by which I don't really mean that I'm sympathetic to, like, well, like, I'm not a revolutionary either. I don't think we have to smash the past in order to have a future. Um, but I do think that, there's constant renewal. I mean, it's just inevitable that people die, cultures die, but things go on. And, I mean, and I mean, I think probably our greatest, like, I'm not a cultural critic, so, I'm just going to talk off the top of my head here. But I mean, I think probably the greatest danger you know, to the kind of renewal that I believe in is the breakdown of family structures. And because, like, the only way that I can really pass on things that I care about is by having a family culture in which my kids also care about at least some of those things. Now, like, my kids are all adults now. I was not success. If I had wanted to brainwash them, I would not have. I wasn't very successful, even though we homeschooled and, the whole thing. Like, they're people, and they are people in one sense of a culture that is not exactly my culture. Um, they are, they range from sort of like young millennials to, my oldest daughter is about to be 30. My youngest is about to be 20. So that's the age range. And in some ways, it's obvious to me that they inhabit cultures that are really alien to, like, what I assumed the world was like when I was their age, and, have sort of, you continue to assume the world is sort of the way it was, even though it isn't. But at the same time, they do care about things that our family cared about when we were, all together and they were growing up. And, and I see it in them in funny ways. I mean, it's not just like a replication, but it is, I mean, people do, as they're growing up, tend to synthesize things that their parents sincerely care about, and that shows up in their lives. And, and I think that continuity, it's hard to replicate that continuity in other contexts where people aren't living together, where one set of people isn't being raised by an older set of people who are, their continuous presences in their lives. And so I guess that would be my biggest worry, really, is, just that basic unit of society seems to be just becoming more and more fragmented and more like a niche lifestyle choice that fewer and fewer people are choosing. So I guess if I was going to say that, there was a source of a feeling of doom for me, that would be it. But I do know young people who are getting married and having families and having that continuity and cohesiveness. So, it'll be there.
It has to be, right? Or there is
or,
no
or
future at all.
nothing, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. It was funny. Sometimes I do these like imaginative exercises just to like torture myself. I was walking my dog the other day and walking along. Our neighborhood kind of verges on this ravine with a road that goes around it. And I was walking my dog around the ravine and like looking at the trees as they were changing and the kind of the houses across the ravine. And I thought, what if none of us was here? Like, what would this be like if it were just like, I don't know, the dogs, like the people were just gone. Human civilization had died out, but this would just be here. And I don't know. I guess the only analogy I can think of is like photographs I've seen from villages that were abandoned after Chernobyl, in that part of the old Soviet Union, and the way that vegetation and animals have just kind of like taken over schools and things like that, and how haunting that is. And of course, I'm thinking this, and I'm thinking, well, of course, but nobody would know this. Nobody would have these perceptions because nobody would be here. So so that was my happy thought while I was walking the dog. I don't know. I mean, it's all, in one sense, it's all ephemeral. And you just kind of have to be good with that somehow.
All vanity, right?
Yes, that's right,
Um,
right. Vanity.
okay, well, I think that's a good note to end on. Sally, thank
Okay.
you so much for
Happy,
talking today.
happy conclusion.
And everyone, go out and get Sally's novel, Works of Mercy, from Wiseblood Books. We can link to it. And keep an eye out for her new books coming out next year.